What if I told you British history isn't a straight line of brave kings, wise queens, and polite progress, but a long, candlelit corridor where doors were quietly locked, papers quietly burned, and certain people quietly disappeared? What if the great national story was often built by making misery look like order and violence look like tradition? And what if the most dangerous parts were never the battles, but the rules written afterward? Tonight we're moving slowly through 50 forbidden facts, things that were minimized, sanitized, or simply left out because they complicate the comforting version. You'll hear names, dates, numbers, and the kinds of everyday details that make the past feel uncomfortably real. If you like long, calm documentaries you can fall asleep to, help this video find the right people. Tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Now, lower the lights, let the noise of the modern world fade, and step with me into the Britain they didn't teach you. Fact 1. Vagrancy was a crime you could commit by existing wrong. Historical records show that, for centuries, poverty in Britain could be treated not as a condition, but as a threat. The setup was simple. Communities feared strangers and authorities feared movement, especially movement they couldn't supervise. The law offered an easy solution. If a person looked poor, travelled without permission, lacked visible means, or couldn't satisfy a magistrate with the right story, they could be branded as a vagrant, not because they'd stolen, attacked, or damaged anything, just because they failed the test of respectability. But the reality is that vagrancy laws often functioned like a social net turned upside down. Instead of catching people, they pinned them down. Whipping, forced labour, imprisonment, removal to a parish. These weren't rare possibilities in earlier periods. They were tools used to manage the poor as a category. This is documented in legislation and local court records, where idle and disorderly persons appear again and again, like a reusable label. The consequences weren't only immediate pain, they were long-term. Families split, work prospects ruined, reputations poisoned, and an entire class trained to avoid visibility. And speaking of visibility, Britain became extremely skilled at making suffering, both public and officially, not its fault. Fact 2. The workhouse was designed to feel worse than poverty. Victorian Britain liked to frame the workhouse as discipline wrapped in charity. The setup was moral. Relief should exist, but it must never be comfortable. Otherwise, people might prefer it. So the workhouse wasn't just a building. It was an argument. It argued that hunger was acceptable, but idleness was not. It argued that desperation must be corrected by humiliation. Except the reality is that the system often punished people for conditions they could not change. Industrial injury, seasonal employment, widowhood, illness, old age. These were common reasons people ended up inside. And once there, the rules were designed to break habits of independence. Families were frequently separated. Uniforms stripped identity into a single institutional look. Meals were monotonous by design, sometimes nutritionally poor. Silence and routine did the rest. According to official inquiries and contemporary accounts, people dreaded the workhouse not simply for hardship, but for the loss of personhood. If you entered, you became a case. Your name mattered less than your category. The consequences reached beyond the walls. The fear of the workhouse pushed people into dangerous labour, exploitative arrangements, and criminalised survival. Meanwhile, the respectable classes could tell themselves a comforting story, that cruelty was kindness, because it was improving the poor. Fact 3. Child labour was not an accident. It was an economic strategy. When people imagine child labour in Britain, they often picture a tragic side effect of early industry. The setup is usually nostalgia with a wince. Horrible, yes, but surely nobody wanted it. But the reality is that child labour was structurally useful. Children were cheaper, smaller, easier to discipline, and less likely to organise. In mills and mines, their bodies fit spaces adults couldn't easily reach. Their wages, when paid, were often taken by parents or guardians under economic pressure, which meant employers could justify paying less and calling it family income. Parliamentary investigations in the 19th century documented long hours, injuries, and the casual normalization of harm. Factory reforms came, but slowly and typically after years of public pressure, political bargaining, and employers insisting that regulation would ruin the economy. And this is the uncomfortable pivot. The economy didn't merely tolerate child suffering, it priced it in. The miracle of cheap cloth and booming production had an unromantic component. Small hands, long shifts, and childhood spent inhaling fibres and fear. The consequences weren't only physical, they were educational and psychological. Stunted learning, exhausted minds, and the early training that life was work first and personhood later. If you think that was the worst of industrial Britain, wait until we talk about the mine. Fact 4. Children worked underground in conditions adults could not endure. Coal-powered Britain's rise. The setup was national pride, steam, iron, railways, empire, an engine fed by black rock, except the reality underground was a world of darkness, heat, cramped tunnels and air that could kill. Children worked as trappers, sitting alone for hours in the dark to open and shut ventilation doors. Others hauled coal through narrow passages, sometimes on hands and knees with straps cutting into their bodies. Some began so young they struggled to describe a life that had ever included sunlight as anything but a rare interruption. Official reports and testimony collected in the 19th century describe exhaustion, deformity, injury, and a level of danger that became routine. Explosions, collapses, flooding, suffocation. Mining disasters were not freak accidents. They were the predictable cost of extracting fuel cheaply and quickly. And the detail that lingers, because it's so quietly horrifying, is how normal this was made to feel. Communities formed around mines, and risk became a local dialect. People learned which signs to read, which sounds meant trouble, which prayers to say. The consequences shaped politics and class identity for generations. Mines didn't just produce coal, they produced grief, solidarity, and a harsh kind of realism about who paid for progress. And speaking of paying, Britain also got very comfortable with debt as a form of captivity. Fact 5. Debtors' prisons turned financial failure into physical confinement. In many eras, Britain treated debt not as an economic problem, but as a moral stain. The setup was social discipline. If people could be imprisoned for owing money, then obligation had teeth. But the reality is that debtors' prisons often trapped people in a loop that made repayment less likely. If you were confined, you couldn't easily work. If you couldn't work, you couldn't pay. Families suffered outside, sometimes ruined by the very attempt to keep a debtor alive. Historical accounts show that conditions varied by prison and by a prisoner's means. And that's the revealing detail. Even in debt, class mattered. Some debtors could purchase better rooms, food, and privileges. Others lived in filth, dependent on charity or family support. So imprisonment became less about justice and more about leverage. It pressured families. It humiliated. It served as a warning sign hanging over the poor. Stay in your place, or your body will answer for your balance sheet. The consequences were social as much as economic. Fear of debt-shaped behavior pushed people into risky labor and helped justify a society where financial failure looked like personal weakness. Meanwhile, the state often avoided looking too closely at the bigger question: why so many people lived one accident away from ruin. Fact 6. Public executions were entertainment, not just punishment. It's tempting to imagine public executions as solemn, somber events. The setup is moral theatre, a community watching justice performed. But the reality was often closer to a festival with a corpse at the centre. Crowds gathered early, vendors sold food and drink, people jostled for views. Sometimes the atmosphere was noisy, even cheerful, because the spectacle was one of the few mass events available to ordinary people. Contemporary newspapers and diaries describe crowds so dense they became dangerous. And the system knew this. The state didn't merely tolerate the crowd, it relied on it. It used visibility as deterrence, turning death into a lesson written in flesh. Except the pivot is that the lesson didn't always land the way authorities wanted. Some executed people became folk heroes. Some speeches were defiant. Some crowds sympathized with the condemned, especially when poverty was clearly part of the story. The consequences were messy. Public executions could inspire fear, yes, but they could also inspire anger at the system, especially when punishment felt disproportionate. And speaking of disproportionate, Britain's legal system became famous for something chillingly efficient: punishing small theft with enormous consequences. Fact 7. The bloody code made property more sacred than life. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, British law expanded capital punishment across a staggering range of offences. The setup was protection. Protect property, protect order, protect the wealthy from the desperation of the poor. But the reality is that theft, sometimes minor theft, could put a person on a path toward the gallows. The legal culture treated property not simply as an economic asset, but as the backbone of society. Threaten it, and you threatened everything. This is documented in the long lists of capital offences and in trial records where theft of goods, livestock, or even certain forms of fraud could lead to a death sentence. Not every sentence was carried out. Pardons, commutations, transportation existed, but the threat was part of the point. The pivot is what this says about priorities. A society that will kill to protect possessions is telling you what it truly worships. Not mercy, not rehabilitation, not even consistency. It worships stability measured in ownership. The consequences included a justice system saturated with fear, bargaining, and unequal outcomes. Those with connections escaped. Those without became examples, and when execution felt too politically risky, Britain had another option: removing people from the country entirely. Fact 8. Transportation was a mass deportation machine disguised as sentencing. Britain transported tens of thousands of convicts across oceans, especially to North America and later to Australia. The setup was practical. Prisons were crowded, crime feared, and distance offered a clean solution. But the reality is that transportation functioned as a vast system of forced relocation, breaking people away from communities, families, and any familiar support. It also served colonial expansion by supplying labor in new territories. Court records show that people could be transported for offences that modern audiences might find astonishingly minor. Again, not always the most brutal crimes, often the crimes of poverty. Once transported, convicts faced harsh regimes, dangerous work, and the long psychological punishment of exile. The pivot is that transportation wasn't only about removing criminals, it was about removing inconvenient people. It reduced visible poverty at home and turned punishment into colonial utility abroad. The consequences rippled across continents. Indigenous populations faced intensified displacement. Colonial societies developed around coerced labor. Britain, meanwhile, could keep telling itself a story of domestic order, neatly exported across the sea. And speaking of exported, Britain also exported disease, sometimes knowingly, and often with breathtaking indifference. Fact 9. Disease was treated as a moral failure, not a public duty. When cholera, typhus, and other diseases swept through crowded cities, the setup was fear. People wanted explanations, and the easiest explanation was always moral. The poor were dirty, careless, sinful. But the reality is that many outbreaks were rooted in infrastructure: water supply, sewage, overcrowded housing, poor nutrition. Yet reforms were slow, often resisted, and regularly framed as helping the undeserving. Official reports and medical debates show how long it took for sanitation to become a political priority rather than a charitable suggestion. And even then, improvement often arrived unevenly. Wealthy areas were upgraded first. Poor areas waited, sometimes for decades. The pivot is that public health became public only when the private classes felt threatened. When disease could cross neighborhood lines, then it became urgent. When it stayed over there, it was treated as a lesson in morality. The consequences were measured in graves. Infant mortality, shortened lives, chronic illness, these were not mysteries. They were the predictable outputs of a society that treated basic cleanliness as a privilege. Meanwhile, Britain's imperial confidence grew, and with it a habit of classifying people as problems to be managed. Fact 10. Britain perfected bureaucratic cruelty, with forms, categories and delays. Some cruelty is loud, some is quiet, procedural and stamped in ink. The setup of modern Britain involved paperwork, parish records, poor relief documents, legal classifications, administrative rules. But the reality is that bureaucracy often served as a weapon. If you can't deny help outright, you can delay it. You can demand proof. You can question character. You can require the right signature, the right witness, the right parish connection. And if someone fails the paperwork test, you can call it their fault. Historical evidence in poor law administration shows endless disputes over settlement. Which parish was responsible for which person? People were shuffled like unwanted parcels. A sick person could be removed. A pregnant woman could be sent away. A family could be fractured by a decision made at a desk. The pivot is that administrative cruelty looks clean. It creates distance between decision and consequence. No one is hurting anyone. They're just following procedure, which, conveniently, still produces suffering. The consequences included insecurity that became a background hum in working-class life, the knowledge that help might exist in theory and still be unreachable in practice. And speaking of unreachable, education too was often rationed like a privilege, not offered like a right. Fact 11. Charity schools were often designed to train obedience, not liberation. The romantic version of early education reform is simple. Kind benefactors helping poor children read and write. The setup is benevolence, warmed by candlelight. But the reality is that many charity schools were as concerned with behaviour as with knowledge. The goal was often to produce disciplined workers, dutiful servants, and orderly citizens, people who could read enough to follow instructions and scripture, but not necessarily enough to challenge the structure above them. Contemporary writings and school rules show heavy emphasis on piety, punctuality, and submission. The curriculum could be narrow, the discipline could be harsh, and the social message was clear. You are being improved for your place, not prepared to change it. The pivot isn't that education was bad, it's that education was controlled. Who learns what and why is never neutral. In a deeply unequal society, literacy could be seen as dangerous if it encouraged political thinking. The consequences were subtle but lasting. Generations learned that help came with strings, that knowledge came with conditions, and that gratitude was expected. Meanwhile, the state and the elite were building a national myth, one that often required convenient forgetting. Fact 12. Britain's traditions were often invented or repackaged. To look ancient, people loved the idea of timeless Britain, ancient customs, unbroken rituals, eternal symbols. The setup is comfort. If it's always been this way, then it must be natural. But the reality is that many traditions were formalized, redesigned, or heavily repackaged in relatively modern periods, especially in the 19th century. When the nation needed unity, legitimacy, and spectacle. This isn't a conspiracy so much as a pattern. Institutions polish themselves, they curate, they choose which version of the past to present. Pageantry becomes a language, uniforms, ceremonies, titles, and carefully staged public events that suggest continuity, even when politics is changing rapidly underneath. The pivot is that invented tradition can be extremely powerful precisely because it feels ancient. If a ritual looks old, it can make authority feel inevitable. And when authority feels inevitable, resistance feels like bad manners. The consequences shape memory. People inherit a story where power looks graceful, orderly, and justified. The rough edges, violence, coercion, exploitation, are edited out. Like background noise someone decided you didn't need to hear. And speaking of editing, Britain also edited its empire into the footnotes while keeping the profits in the main text. Fact 13. Empire was funded by systems of coercion, that were often legal. The setup of empire in British memory is exploration, trade, and civilizing rhetoric, ships, maps, flags, and a steady voice claiming the future. But the reality is that empire expanded through coercion, treaties signed under pressure, military force, economic manipulation, and administrative systems designed to extract wealth. Much of it was legal in the sense that laws were written to make it legal. That's the trick. Official documents, parliamentary debates, and colonial records show a pattern. When extraction meets resistance, the system reframes resistance as disorder, and disorder as justification for harsher control. The pivot is that legality isn't the same as justice. When one side writes the rules, it can make almost anything look orderly. Land can be acquired, labor can be regulated, punishment can be necessary. The consequences were enormous, and they didn't stay overseas. Profits flowed back into Britain, shaping cities, institutions, and fortunes. The imperial story wasn't a separate chapter. It was woven into domestic life, into buildings, museums, and financial systems. Meanwhile, at home, the elite guarded power with a different sort of law, one that restricted who could even participate in the political game. Fact 14. Britain's democracy expanded slowly because the elite feared the crowd. It's easy to narrate British political reform as a steady march toward fairness. The setup is reassuring. Britain becomes more democratic over time, and everyone politely agrees. But the reality is that expansions of voting rights were often resisted fiercely. The elite feared that giving political power to the propertyless would threaten property itself. Reform was frequently framed as a dangerous experiment, not an obvious moral step. Historical records of debates and public responses show anxiety about mob rule, moral panic about the working class, and an insistence that only certain people were fit to vote. Even after reforms, large groups remained excluded for long periods, by gender, by wealth, by social status. The pivot is that reform often arrived not because power became generous, but because pressure became unavoidable. Protest movements, unrest, and the fear of revolution, especially in a Europe that had seen revolutions, made compromise seem safer than refusal. The consequences were partial victories and long delays. People learned that rights were not gifts, they were negotiated under strain. And speaking of strain, industrial Britain was a pressure cooker, and when it burst, the state responded with force. Fact 15. Protest was frequently treated as a security threat, not a political message. When crowds gathered to demand reform, better wages, safer working conditions, representation, the setup from above was suspicion. Authorities often assumed that a crowd was a potential riot waiting to happen. But the reality is that many protests were organized, purposeful, and political. People assembled because formal channels didn't listen. Petitions could be ignored, newspapers could be controlled, elections could exclude them. Contemporary accounts describe a pattern: surveillance, infiltration, arrests, and the use of law to limit assembly. When violence happened, it could become the headline that justified harsher control, regardless of how the violence began. The pivot is that the state often preferred disorder to negotiation, because disorder could be punished. Negotiation implied legitimacy, punishment implied hierarchy. The consequences included trauma, radicalization, and a deep cultural memory, the sense that power speaks politely only when it has to, and otherwise speaks through batons, prisons, and legal charges. Meanwhile, behind all this, one institution remained remarkably stable: the monarchy, partly because it learned when to bend and when to hide. Fact 16. Royal image management was a survival skill, not a modern PR problem. The setup of monarchy in popular history is glamour and inevitability. Crowns sparkle, carriages roll, and the nation politely watches. But the reality is that monarchy survives by managing perception. This is not unique to Britain, but Britain refined it into a craft. When the monarch is politically vulnerable, image becomes armor. Historical patterns show careful control of ceremonies, selective public appearances, strategic charity, and the use of rituals that turn authority into emotion. Crowds feel something, and that feeling becomes a substitute for argument. The pivot is that the monarchy often did best when it looked least political. When politics became controversial, the crown stepped back, while still benefiting from the system politics maintained. The evidence isn't a single document. It's a long behavioural record across reign, moments when royals embraced visibility, and moments when they retreated into silence. The choreography changed as newspapers grew, then radio, then television, but the principle remained stable. Do not let the public see the machinery too clearly. The consequences include a national story where monarchy feels like atmosphere, not power, even though it has always been entangled with power. And speaking of entanglement, Britain's ruling class often protected itself through networks that were never written in law, but operated like law. Fact 17. Who you knew could matter more than what you did. Britain's class system wasn't only wealth, it was networks. Schools, clubs, patronage, and family ties that functioned like hidden infrastructure. The setup was social stability, a sense that the right people naturally ended up in the right positions, except the reality is that connections could soften consequences, open doors, and rewrite narratives. An accusation could become a misunderstanding. A failure could become a learning experience. A scandal could be buried under discretion and time. This is visible in patterns across institutions, legal outcomes, military promotions, political appointments, business opportunities. The documents that survive often show how recommendations, introductions, and reputational shielding operated alongside formal rules. The pivot is not that merit didn't exist, it's that merit competed with social architecture. And when social architecture is strong enough, it can make inequality look like destiny. The consequences were quietly devastating for those outside the network. Talent without access became frustration. Ambition without patronage became scandalous, and survival often required deference, learning how to speak the right way, dress the right way, and never appear too hungry for power. Meanwhile, the people who benefited could insist sincerely that they simply deserved it. If you think this is only about the past, listen carefully to how familiar the logic still sounds. Fact 18. Britain's policing grew out of fear of the urban poor. The setup is usually told like a tidy origin story. Modern policing arrives to keep people safe. But the reality is that British policing developed as much from anxiety about crowds as from concern about crime. In the 18th century, you have experiments like the Bow Street Runners, and in 1829, the Metropolitan Police is established in London, an institutional answer to a city that is swelling, restless, and increasingly political. Factory towns are expanding, wages are unstable, food prices spike, and meetings multiply. Authority looks at a crowd and sees not citizens, but a risk. Historical records show early policing focused heavily on order, preventing disorder, controlling assembly, and watching the kinds of neighbourhoods that frightened the respectable classes. And that's the pivot. Policing was not just about stopping violence, it was about managing visibility, keeping certain people moving, keeping certain spaces quiet, keeping protest from turning into power. The consequences are written into the relationship between the public and the state. When the first assumption is suspicion, trust doesn't grow naturally. It has to be earned, and often it wasn't. And speaking of what happens when crowds gather, sometimes the state responded with a lesson written in blood. Fact 19. Peterloo showed how quickly order could mean slaughter in 1819. Tens of thousands gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand political reform. The setup was disciplined protests, banners, speeches, families attending, people trying to be heard in a system that was structured to ignore them. But the reality is that authorities saw a threatening mass. Local leaders called in cavalry. The attempt to arrest speakers turned into chaos, and the crowd, packed tightly, had nowhere to go. Contemporary accounts describe sabres, panic, trampling, and the sickening speed at which a public meeting became a killing ground. The pivot is that Peterloo wasn't a mysterious riot that got out of hand. It was a political moment treated as a security emergency, and the aftermath mattered as much as the event. The state responded with laws that restricted meetings and tightened control, because nothing says we heard you like making it harder to speak. The consequences were long and bitter: raid, radicalization, and the slow understanding that public order was often defined by those who already had power. Meanwhile, the state had another method of control, less dramatic than cavalry, but equally effective: controlling information. Fact 20. Taxing newspapers was a way to tax knowledge. The setup sounds boring: stamp duties, paper taxes, small fees. But the reality is that these financial pressures shaped who could afford to read and who could afford to publish. In the 18th and 19th centuries, taxes on newspapers and paper made printed information more expensive. Officially, these were revenue measures. Unofficially, according to many contemporary critics, they helped limit the spread of cheap, radical ideas among working people. The pivot is that censorship doesn't always look like a man burning pamphlets. Sometimes it looks like pricing people out of conversation. If a paper costs too much, the public sphere becomes a club with an entry fee. This is documented in political debates and the long campaigns against the so-called taxes on knowledge. When restrictions eased over time, cheap newspapers and mass readership expanded, and suddenly politics didn't feel like something that happened only to other people. The consequences were cultural. A population that can't easily access news becomes easier to lead. A population that reads widely becomes harder to manage with slogans alone. And speaking of being managed, Britain also reshaped the landscape itself, often in ways that quietly removed survival options from the poor. Fact 21. Enclosure turned common land into private property and poverty into trespass. The setup is progress: improved agriculture, efficient farming, modern land use. Enclosure is sometimes presented as an inevitable step toward prosperity. But the reality is that enclosure, especially through parliamentary acts, often meant communities losing access to common land they depended on for grazing animals, gathering wood, or simply surviving bad seasons. What had been a shared safety net became fenced and owned. Historical records show enclosure didn't just change fields, it changed lives. A family that could once keep a pig, collect fuel, or glean leftovers now faced a new reality. Do it anyway, and it's theft. Walk where you used to walk, and it's trespass. That's the pivot. Property lines can create criminals overnight. When survival practices become illegal, poverty becomes a legal status, not just an economic one. The consequences were migration, overcrowded towns, and a labour force with fewer alternatives, exactly the kind of workforce early industry loved. If people cannot feed themselves independently, they become easier to hire on harsh terms. And speaking of harsh terms, Britain also learned that hunger could be used as policy, not just misfortune. Fact 22. Hunger was often treated as a moral problem. So relief came with punishment. In many crises, the setup sounded compassionate. Relief exists, soup is served, charity is raised, but the reality is that help was frequently structured to deter. Relief systems could involve public scrutiny, humiliating questions, and conditions designed to make the process so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would endure it. In some places, assistance was tied to labour tests or moral judgment. The logic was blunt. If relief feels shameful, fewer people will ask for it. Historical accounts and administrative records show authorities frequently worried about dependency more than starvation. And that's the pivot. When policy treats poverty as laziness, it responds to hunger like it's misbehaviour. The hungry aren't seen as people in crisis. They're seen as people trying to cheat. The consequences are predictable. People delay seeking help until it's too late. Families collapse under preventable pressure, and a society learns to look away because it can tell itself a story. They should have tried harder. Meanwhile, in Ireland, this logic collided with catastrophe on a scale that still sits like a bruise under the national memory. Fact 23. During the Great Irish Famine, policy often moved slower than death. The setup is that famine is a natural disaster. And yes, the potato blight was biological. But the reality is that the scale of death and displacement in the 1840s was shaped by human decisions, how relief was designed, how markets were allowed to function, and what ideologies guided response. Contemporary records and parliamentary debates show fierce arguments about dependency, free markets, and whether large-scale intervention would damage the moral fabric of society. Relief was offered, then cut, then reshaped. Work requirements were imposed, bureaucratic hurdles appeared, and all the while people were starving, sick, and fleeing. The pivot is not a simplistic claim that Britain wanted people to die. It's that prevailing political beliefs treated suffering as a kind of lesson, and lessons are easier to teach when you don't have to watch the classroom. The consequences are documented in death tolls, mass emigration, and trauma that echoed for generations. A famine becomes more than hunger. It becomes memory, resentment, and a permanent argument about what power owes to the powerless. And speaking of power owing something, Britain built enormous wealth within an empire that included one of history's most lucrative legal horrors. Fact 24. Slavery wasn't a side story. Britain's economy was entangled with it. The setup many people inherit is neat. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in 1833. Therefore, Britain is a moral hero in the story. But the reality is that Britain spent centuries profiting from the trafficking and enslavement of human beings, and British finance, shipping, insurance, and plantation supply chains were deeply entangled with it. Abolition matters, but it sits on top of a long foundation of profit. The pivot comes in 1833. Emancipation in the British Empire did not primarily compensate the enslaved. It compensated enslavers. Historical records show that a vast sum was paid out to slave owners for the loss of what the law had treated as property. Enslaved people then faced apprenticeship systems that continued coercive labor under new language. The consequences are visible in fortunes, institutions, and land ownership patterns that didn't evaporate when law changed. The money didn't vanish. It moved into banks, estates, and social power. And speaking of money, some of these payments echoed forward far longer than people like to admit. Fact 25. The state paid enslavers for decades, and the public carried the costs. The setup is that abolition was a clean moral break. But the reality is that the compensation package for enslavers was so large, it required serious state financing. Historical financial records show that the government raised funds to pay slave owners, and that servicing this kind of long-term obligation meant the cost didn't disappear quickly. The pivot is uncomfortable. Even after slavery ended legally, the state treated the financial pain of enslavers as urgent, measurable, and worthy of protection, while the human pain of the formerly enslaved was met with limited material repair. You don't have to believe in a grand conspiracy to see the pattern. Money received organized sympathy. Human beings received paperwork and sermons about self-reliance. The consequences are cultural as much as economic. It shaped who was remembered as a loser in abolition and who was quietly allowed to become a pillar of society afterward. It also fed the modern confusion where people assume Britain's relationship to slavery is mainly about ending it, rather than sustaining it for generations. Meanwhile, the empire carried coercion into other forms of labour too, because when one profitable system becomes politically toxic, another tends to appear with a cleaner name. Fact 26. Indenture and coerced labour filled gaps left by slavery. After abolition, the setup sounded humane. Contract labour, migration for opportunity, wages instead of chains. But the reality in many parts of the empire included indentured labour systems that could be deeply coercive. People were recruited, sometimes misled, sent across oceans, bound by contracts they barely understood, and trapped by debt, isolation, and harsh enforcement. The line between free and forced could become very thin when the worker is far from home, under surveillance, and dependent on an employer for survival. Historical records and contemporary critics describe brutal working conditions and legal structures that favored plantation owners and colonial authorities. And that's the pivot. Empire didn't need the exact same mechanism to produce the same outcome. It needed labor that couldn't easily refuse. The consequences were diaspora communities built under pressure, families separated by distance, and long legacies of exploitation that later got narrated as simple migration stories, scrubbed of the coercion that shaped them. And speaking of being scrubbed, Britain also scrubbed violence by turning it into trade policy. Fact 27. The Opium Wars were about commerce, and the moral language came later. The setup in many national stories is vague. Conflict in China, complicated diplomacy, unfortunate misunderstanding. But the reality is that the Opium Wars in the 19th century were tightly linked to British commercial interests, including the opium trade. When Chinese authorities tried to restrict the importation of opium, because it was devastating communities, Britain used military force to protect economic access. Historical diplomatic correspondence and accounts of the wars show the collision between moral outrage and commercial determination. The pivot is how comfortable states can become with violence when it's framed as protecting trade. The language of civilization often followed behind the barrels of guns, tidying the narrative after the damage was done. The consequences included treaties imposed under pressure, territorial concessions, and deep resentment toward foreign interference. It also established a pattern. When profit is at stake, the empire could find a justification, even if it had to build one out of rhetoric after the fact. Meanwhile, back home, bodies were also a kind of commodity, especially when medicine demanded them. Fact 28. Body snatching thrived because the poor were easier to steal. The setup is Gothic, shadowy men, graveyards, midnight digging, an eerie footnote to medical history, but the reality is colder. Anatomy schools needed bodies for dissection. Legal supply was limited. Demand rose, so a black market appeared, and it targeted the people least able to defend themselves, even in death. Grave robbing wasn't random. Poor burial grounds were easier to access, less protected, and less likely to trigger a scandal powerful people cared about. The pivot is that the poor were vulnerable even as corpses. Their families had fewer resources to guard graves, fewer legal tools to fight back, and fewer newspapers willing to rage on their behalf. This is documented in court cases, public panic, and the eventual legal response. The Anatomy Act of 1832, which expanded legal access to bodies, often the bodies of those who died in institutions unclaimed. The consequences are grimly logical. Medical progress advanced, but it advanced on a moral bargain. The bodies of the powerless would become educational material, whether consent existed or not. And speaking of consent, Britain often treated the poor as if consent was optional, not only in death, but in life. Fact 29. Institutions could swallow people, and sometimes never give them back. The setup was care, hospitals, asylums, workhouses, reformatories, places supposedly built to help, improve, or protect. But the reality is that institutions could become warehouses for the inconvenient. Mental illness, disability, poverty, immorality, pregnancy outside marriage, many conditions could land someone inside an institution where outside contact was limited and authority was absolute. Records and investigations show that standards varied, and some staff tried sincerely to help. The pivot is that the system structure enabled abuse. When a person's testimony is discounted, when the public can't see inside, and when release depends on the judgment of the same authority that confined you, power becomes dangerously self-reinforcing. The consequences were lost lives measured not only in death, but in years. People disappeared into routine. Families were pressured to surrender relatives. Shame did the rest. The institution became a place society used to hide what it didn't want to face. Meanwhile, even the dead were handled in ways that revealed class, because dignity, like everything else, could be rationed. Fact 30. Pauper burials turned death into a final sorting system. The setup is that death is equalizing. Everyone ends up in the same ground. But the reality is that burial practices in Britain often reinforce class even in the grave. Pauper burials could be rushed, unmarked, communal, and stripped of ceremony. Families might be unable to afford a proper funeral, and the state's priority was disposal, not dignity. Historical records show how local authorities managed burial costs, sometimes choosing the cheapest options available, and the pivot is the emotional violence of it. Death isn't only grief, it's ritual. When ritual is denied, the living are denied a language for mourning. The consequences included a quiet, cultural message. Some lives are worth remembering with stone, and others are worth remembering only as a line in a ledger. It also created a physical landscape of forgotten people beneath cities, unmarked, unknowable, absorbed into the ground without name. And speaking of cities, Victorian Britain built urban spaces that were in places essentially experiments in how much human misery could be packed into a small area before the system admitted it had a problem. Fact 31. Slum conditions were known about and tolerated for decades. The setup is the classic Victorian contradiction. Wealth and poverty side by side, fog and gaslight, gentlemen stepping over beggars on their way to the theatre. But the reality is that slum conditions were not a secret. Reformers documented overcrowding, damp rooms, poor ventilation, sewage, and families living in spaces that couldn't reasonably support life. Reports described streets where disease moved like weather. The pivot is that knowledge didn't automatically create action. Landlords profited. Industry needed workers near factories. Local authorities often lacked will, funds, or courage to confront property interests, and the respectable public could treat slums as a moral cautionary tale rather than a political failure. Consequences stacked up: epidemics, high infant mortality, and communities living under constant stress. It's also why certain discoveries of the era, like sanitation reform, were less like sudden enlightenment and more like delayed acceptance of what the poor had always known. And speaking of sanitation, sometimes the stench became so unavoidable that even Parliament couldn't pretend it was someone else's problem. Fact 32. The Great Stink made public health a priority because the rich couldn't escape it. In 1858, the setup was humiliation. The River Thames, used as a dumping ground, became so foul during hot weather that the smell seeped into the heart of government. Curtains were reportedly soaked with chemicals in an attempt to block the stench. But the reality is that London's sewage crisis had been building for years. People had warned about contaminated water and disease. Cholera outbreaks had already shown that miasma theories were insufficient. And still, large-scale infrastructure moved slowly. The pivot is cynical but simple. When the filth reached the powerful, it became urgent. When it stayed in poor neighbourhoods, it was tragic but tolerable. Once Parliament itself couldn't breathe comfortably, engineering suddenly became a national mission. The consequences included major sewage works and a transformation in public health policy. And yes, it saved lives. But the origin story matters because it reveals the true trigger, not empathy, but proximity. Meanwhile, empire was dealing with its own crises, and Britain's response to colonial resistance in the 20th century produced a chapter that was aggressively minimised for decades. Fact 33. In Kenya, detention and abuse were used to break an anti-colonial movement. The setup in older imperial nostalgia is that Britain managed decolonisation with restraint and good manners. But the reality, documented in official inquiries, survivor accounts, and later legal proceedings, shows that in 1950s Kenya, during the Mau Mau emergency, detention camps and harsh counterinsurgency measures became central tools of control. People were detained in large numbers, interrogations, forced labour and abuse were reported. The system framed this as security. Many Kenyans experienced it as brutality designed to crush political possibility. The pivot is the quietness afterward. For years, the broader British public could live without confronting the detail. Empire ended, and the story shifted to the comforting version. Independence granted, handshake, farewell. The consequences were wounds that lasted long after the camps closed, trauma, anger, and a deep distrust of imperial narratives. It also raised a darker question. If violence was used to sustain authority late in the empire, how often had similar methods been used earlier, when scrutiny was weaker? And speaking of scrutiny, sometimes the story stayed hidden because the paperwork was literally moved out of sight. Fact 34. Britain kept migrated colonial files, and their existence was downplayed. The setup is archival innocence. History is what survives in records, and the records are what they are. But the reality is that during decolonization, many colonial documents were removed, retained, or managed in ways that limited public access and delayed accountability. The phrase migrated archives became associated with collections of files held outside the countries they described, and for years the public understanding of what existed and where was murky. The pivot isn't a cartoonish image of villains cackling over a shredder. It's the more mundane, more believable mechanism: administrative control over information. If files are dispersed, restricted, or quietly retained, then truth becomes slower to assemble. Victims struggle to prove pattern. Investigators struggle to connect dots. The system buys time. The consequences include delayed justice and delayed public understanding. When the record is incomplete, denial becomes easier. And when denial is easier, national myths stay clean, at least for a while. If you think this is only about empire, remember, the same instinct to manage narratives runs through domestic history too, especially when the story threatens powerful reputations. Fact 35. Respectability was a tool that could ruin lives without a trial. The setup was polite society's favourite weapon, a reputation. In Britain, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, respectability wasn't just a personal virtue, it was a social passport. It decided who got hired, who got rented to, who got believed, and who could be quietly discarded. But the reality is that respectability worked like a court with no appeal. A rumour could do what a judge never did. A pregnancy outside marriage, a hint of immorality, a failed apprenticeship, a public argument, the wrong pub, the wrong friend. Suddenly a person could become untouchable. And in a country where survival often depended on informal networks and references, being untouchable meant being hungry. Historical records in poor relief, workhouse admissions, and moral reform campaigns show how quickly judgments slid into policy. Women and girls were especially exposed to this. Once labelled fallen, you didn't just lose status, you lost options. The system could then call your desperation proof of your character. The pivot is that respectability didn't protect society from harm. It protected society from discomfort. It helped Britain pretend that suffering was deserved and therefore not urgent. And speaking of women being treated as problems rather than people, Britain actually passed laws that turned women's bodies into state-managed territory. Fact 36. The Contagious Diseases Acts made women pay for men's infections. In the 1860s, the setup was public health and military readiness. Britain worried about sexually transmitted infections among soldiers and sailors. The solution, authorities claimed, was medical regulation, but the reality was one-sided policing of women. The Contagious Diseases Acts, passed in 1864 and expanded in 1866 and 1869, allowed authorities in certain garrison towns and ports to target women suspected of prostitution. Suspected, often on appearance, reputation, or local hostility. Those women could be forced into invasive medical examinations. If found infected, they could be confined in lock hospitals. The pivot is the moral hypocrisy baked into the structure. Men were treated as unfortunate victims of temptation. Women were treated as vectors, walking diseases, punished for the same acts that men were expected, culturally, to commit. The acts provoked fierce opposition, including organised campaigning, and were eventually repealed in the 1880s. The consequences were trauma, injustice, and a clear demonstration of how health can become an excuse for control when the target is politically weak. Meanwhile, Britain also had a habit of solving manpower problems in a way that sounds almost fictional, until you realize it was routine. Fact 37. Press gangs turned men into navy property. The setup is empire's favorite demand. Ships need sailors. In wartime, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Royal Navy required enormous manpower to keep fleets moving, blockades tight, and trade routes protected. But the reality is that Britain relied heavily on impressment, forcing men into naval service. Press gangs could seize men from ports, taverns, and streets, particularly those already connected to maritime work. Legal lines existed in theory, but in practice, the power imbalance was immense. A man could protest, be beaten, and wake up as navy labour. The pivot is that Britain celebrated Rule Britannia while quietly practicing something that looked uncomfortably like kidnapping. This wasn't a secret. It was a fact of life in many coastal communities, woven into fear, resentment, and dark jokes about avoiding certain streets when a press gang was active. The consequences were broken families, coerced service, and the lingering truth that national power often depends on the bodies of people who never volunteered for the glory. And speaking of bodies, once you were in uniform, discipline could be enforced with a brutality that the modern mind struggles to place in civilized Britain. Fact 38. Flogging was an institutional language, not a rare excess. The setup is discipline. Armies and navies have always insisted they require strict order to function, especially under stress. Britain's forces were no different. But the reality is that corporal punishment, especially flogging, was for a long time a normal tool of control. The cat o' nine tails wasn't an exotic horror. It was a routine threat. Flogging could be ordered for theft, drunkenness, disobedience, or simply being the wrong kind of troublesome. And the point wasn't only pain, it was spectacle. Punishment was often public, making the body into a warning sign. Historical records show restrictions tightened over time, and the practice was eventually abolished in peacetime contexts in the late 19th century. But for generations, British military life included the knowledge that your back could become the message. The pivot is what it reveals about hierarchy. When an institution treats public injury as administration, it's telling you that individual dignity is less important than order, and that order is defined from above. The consequences included trauma, resentment, and a culture where violence could be normalized as professionalism. Meanwhile, at home, the state didn't always need a whip. Sometimes it used hunger wages, and when desperation grew, it had prisons ready for the unfit. Fact 39. Reform sometimes meant locking up the poor for being inconvenient. Britain loved the language of improvement. The setup sounded morale. Reformatories, industrial schools, correctional institutions, places designed to rescue children and rehabilitate offenders. But the reality is that these institutions often blurred the line between help and containment. Children could be sent away for beyond control behavior that reads, in modern terms, like poverty, neglect, or a family collapsing under pressure. Once inside, routines could be harsh, labor could be heavy, and contact with family could be limited. Official inspections and public debates show that some reformers genuinely believed in rescue. The pivot is that rescue often came wrapped in punishment. Britain frequently treated deprivation as a character flaw to be beaten out through discipline, rather than a condition to be relieved through support. The consequences were generations of people institutionalized not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient to the social order. And for many, the institution didn't correct anything except their belief that the world might ever treat them gently. And speaking of children being used as policy tools, Britain also moved children across oceans as if they were cargo with good intentions stamped on the crate. Fact 40. Child migration schemes sent thousands away, and many were misled. The setup was salvation. For decades, various schemes sent impoverished or institutionalized children from Britain to colonies and former colonies, particularly Canada and Australia, framed as opportunities for better lives. But the reality is that many children were separated from families under pressure, misinformed about whether parents were alive, or told they were orphans when they were not. Some faced harsh labor, neglect, and abuse. Oversight was inconsistent, and distance made accountability difficult. Historical records and later investigations show this wasn't a tiny, isolated phenomenon. Large numbers were involved across many years. The pivot is that child migration solved multiple problems at once for authorities. It reduced visible poverty at home and supplied labor abroad, all while wearing the mask of philanthropy. The consequences were identity fractures that lasted lifetimes, children growing into adults with missing histories, broken family links, and a sense that their childhood was not a chapter, it was a relocation. Meanwhile, Britain's domestic story kept insisting it was becoming more enlightened. Then the 20th century arrived, and enlightenment met artillery. Fact 41. Britain executed soldiers for cowardice, even as shell shock was real. The setup of the First World War is sacrifice and endurance, and yes, millions endured the unimaginable, but the reality includes an official refusal to fully accept psychological collapse as injury. Historical military records show that the British Army executed hundreds of its own soldiers for military offences, including desertion and cowardice. The numbers often cited for executions in the First World War are in the low hundreds, and the cases have been debated ever since. What makes this especially bitter is that shell shock, what we would now recognise as severe trauma, was widespread and often poorly understood or treated with suspicion. The pivot is that the state demanded an impossible emotional standard. You may be blown apart physically, but you must remain obedient mentally. If your mind broke under industrial slaughter, you could be punished as if it was a moral failure. Decades later, public attitudes shifted, and posthumous pardons were granted for many of those executed. The consequences, though, were permanent for the individuals and their families. Shame, silence, and grief wrapped in an official verdict. And speaking of science being used to justify policy, Britain also flirted with ideas that treated entire groups of people as problems to be managed biologically. Fact 42. Eugenic thinking shaped policy, even when the word wasn't said out loud. The setup was modernity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some intellectual and political circles across Europe and North America became fascinated with eugenics, the idea that society could be improved by controlling who reproduced. But the reality in Britain included policies and debates that treated disability, poverty, and feeble-mindedness as hereditary threats. The Mental Deficiency Act of 1913, for example, expanded institutional control over people categorized as mentally defective, often based on broad, subjective judgments that tangled disability with class prejudice. The pivot is that eugenic thinking rarely arrives wearing a skull mask. It arrives wearing a clipboard. It claims compassion. It claims efficiency. It claims the future. And it tends to target the people least able to fight back, the poor, the marginalized, the inconvenient. Britain did not follow the same sterilization paths as some other countries on the same scale, but the consequences of classification, institutionalization, and stigma was still profound. Lives narrowed by labels. Meanwhile, Britain's relationship with slavery also had a domestic dimension. People preferred to keep blurry. Fact 43. Slavery. In Britain was legally murky, which helped the powerful. The setup many people learn is simple. Slavery happened over there. The plantations were overseas, the brutality exported. But the reality is that enslaved Africans were present in Britain, especially in port cities and wealthy households, and the legal status of slavery on British soil was complex and contested. The 1772 Somerset case is often summarised as slavery was abolished in England, but the actual pivot is more cautious. The ruling is commonly understood as limiting the ability to forcibly remove an enslaved person from England without legal basis. It did not cleanly and instantly end all forms of bondage, nor did it erase the broader imperial system. That ambiguity mattered. When law is unclear, power fills the gaps. The wealthy could behave as if ownership was normal, while the state avoided a definitive moral confrontation until later. The consequences were human lives lived in uncertainty, people treated as property in a society that wanted to believe it was too free and too civilized for such a thing. And speaking of too civilized, Britain also had violent reactions when the empire's people arrived at the imperial centre. Fact 44. After both world wars, racial violence erupted in British streets. The setup was patriotism. Britain relied on sailors, workers and soldiers from across the empire and beyond. Wartime created movement, mixing and new communities. But the reality is that post-war periods saw racial tension and in some places outright violence. In 1919, several British port cities experienced serious unrest and attacks targeting black communities and other minorities, shaped by competition for jobs, housing pressure, and racist hostility. Decades later, in 1958, the Notting Hill riots became one of the most notorious examples of racial violence in modern British history. The pivot is that the empire was celebrated when it supplied labour and loyalty, but resented when its people claimed space and belonging in Britain itself. The same country that ruled over diverse populations could become furious at diversity on its own streets. The consequences included fear, community trauma, and the slow emergence of anti-racist organising as survival strategy. It also showed that Britishness was often policed socially long before it was discussed openly in politics. Meanwhile, Britain's immigration story contained another quiet cruelty, inviting people in, then treating them like paperwork errors decades later. Fact 45. The Windrush scandal showed how easily a life can be erased by administration. The setup was post-war rebuilding. People from the Caribbean and elsewhere came to Britain, often as citizens of the Empire and Commonwealth, answering labour needs in transport, healthcare and industry. But the reality is that decades later, some long-settled residents were told they were not legally in the country. They faced loss of work, denial of healthcare, detention, and threats of removal. Many had lived in Britain for most of their lives. Some lacked formal documentation because, at the time of arrival, they were not treated as foreigners who needed proof. The pivot is that bureaucratic cruelty doesn't require shouting. It requires only that a system decides your existence must be proven on demand, and that the burden sits entirely on you. The consequences were devastating. Families torn by stress, livelihoods destroyed, trust shattered, and it revealed a deeper pattern in British history. Paperwork as a weapon, wielded most effectively against people with the least power to contest it. And speaking of contesting power, Northern Ireland became one of the starkest examples of what happens when a state treats political conflict as a policing problem first. Fact 46. Internment without trial. In Northern Ireland deepened the conflict. The setup was security. In 1971, during the period known as the Troubles, internment without trial was introduced in Northern Ireland, presented as a necessary response to violence. But the reality is that internment inflamed tensions, especially because it was widely perceived as unevenly applied and based on flawed intelligence. People were arrested, detained, and held without the normal protections of trial. Communities interpreted it not as safety, but as collective punishment. Historical accounts, official reports, and long public memory show the pivot. Internment can feel like control, but it often produces the opposite. It creates more anger, more mistrust, and more recruits for resistance because it tells people the system isn't designed to hear them, only to contain them. The consequences were intensified conflict and a deeper fracture between communities and the state. It also set the stage for moments that would become international symbols of what order can look like when it turns violent. Fact 47. Bloody Sunday turned a march into a national wound. In January 1972, the setup was civil rights protest in Derry, Londonderry. People marching against policies they saw as unjust. Public assembly, political expression, a familiar pattern in British history, but the reality became catastrophe. Soldiers shot unarmed civilians, and the event, known as Bloody Sunday, became one of the most infamous moments of the Troubles. For years, arguments raged about what happened, why it happened, and how it was justified. Later, investigations concluded that those shot posed no threat that could justify the shootings. The pivot is not only the deaths, it's the aftermath, the long, corrosive effect of denial, delay, and contested narratives. When the state is seen to kill and then insist it was right, trust doesn't simply crack, it splinters. The consequences were political radicalization, grief that hardened into identity, and a deepening sense that British authority could not be neutral in Northern Ireland, because neutrality doesn't fire bullets into marchers. And speaking of contested narratives, Britain's modern history contains domestic flashpoints where allegations of state overreach refuse to die quietly. Fact 48. Orgreave became a symbol of how policing can serve politics. The setup was industrial conflict. During the 1984-85 miners' strike, tensions between communities and the government escalated into confrontations that felt less like law enforcement and more like war by other means. One of the most notorious flashpoints was Orgreave in 1984, where police clashed with striking miners. Accounts and later analysis have alleged excessive force, questionable charges, and narratives shaped to justify the response. The event remains deeply disputed, not only because of what happened on the day, but because of what people believe the day represented, the state demonstrating that it could break a working-class movement. The pivot is that when policing becomes entangled with political strategy, every baton strike carries a message beyond "keep order." It says who counts. It says whose anger is tolerated. It says what happens when a community refuses to be quiet. The consequences include long-standing distrust, unresolved arguments about accountability, and a cultural memory where the state is not a referee, it's a participant. Meanwhile, alongside visible confrontations, Britain also developed quieter methods: watching, infiltrating, recording. Fact 49. Undercover surveillance of activists turned intimacy into intelligence. The setup is counter-extremism and public safety. States argue they must monitor groups that might cause harm. Britain is no exception, and undercover policing units have existed for decades. But the reality, revealed through investigations, court cases, and public disclosures, is that undercover operations sometimes targeted political campaigners and activist groups in ways that blurred the line between preventing violence and managing dissent. Some operations involved long-term infiltration, some involved identities built over years, and in some notorious cases, intimate relationships were used as part of maintaining cover, leaving people feeling not just watched, but violated. The pivot is that surveillance doesn't only gather information, it shapes behavior, it makes movements paranoid, it fractures trust, it turns friendship into a risk calculation. The consequences include trauma for those deceived, suspicion within political communities, and the chilling lesson that the state may not need to beat you in the street to weaken you. It can simply make you doubt everyone standing next to you. And speaking of weakening, there's one more forbidden truth that ties so many of these together. Britain's greatest talent wasn't always conquest, it was making harsh systems feel normal. Fact 50. Britain often solved crisis by making the weak pay quietly. The setup is the national myth. Britain is resilient, pragmatic, orderly. When something goes wrong, the story says Britain adjusts sensibly and moves on. But the reality, across centuries, is that Britain often managed crisis by shifting the cost downward. When food prices rose, the poor endured hunger and moral lectures. When cities expanded, slums absorbed the overflow. When labour was needed, children and coerced workers filled gaps. When war demanded bodies, discipline enforced obedience. When empire demanded profit, violence and extraction were rationalized as administration. When society felt uncomfortable, institutions hid the inconvenient. The pivot is that this pattern isn't just history being harsh. It's a consistent mechanism. The people with the least power are asked to carry the most weight, and then blamed when they stagger. Historical records, inquiries, debates, and personal accounts all show versions of the same structure. Britain didn't always lack compassion. It often lacked urgency until the consequences reached the powerful. The consequences are the Britain beneath the postcard, a country built not only from castles and parliaments, but from workhouses, docks, debt cells, censored papers, stolen bodies, and locked doors. And once you see the structure, the forbidden part isn't that these facts exist, it's that we were trained not to connect them. So now, as the room goes quiet and the modern world feels far away, notice what these 50 facts have been doing, softly, insistently, like rain on stone. They've been showing you a Britain that often preferred order to justice and appearance to repair, a Britain that could build magnificent institutions and still use them to ration dignity, a Britain that could speak the language of morality while pricing cruelty into policy, a Britain that could wrap power in tradition, wrap punishment in procedure, wrap exploitation in legality, and then act surprised when the human cost turned into anger. And none of this means the country is uniquely evil. That's the lazy conclusion. The more useful conclusion is that Britain is a case study in how sophisticated societies commit harm without calling it harm. The violence isn't always a battlefield. Sometimes it's a form. Sometimes it's a label. Sometimes it's a locked gate that used to be open land. Sometimes it's a public ritual meant to teach obedience. Sometimes it's a quiet, administrative decision that removes someone's life with the gentlest possible handwriting. If you remember anything from tonight, let it be this. The past isn't only a sequence of events, it's a set of habits, and habits repeat unless someone names them. Because once you can see the pattern, poverty treated as guilt, protest treated as threat, empire treated as destiny, reputation treated as law, you start noticing where modern echoes live, not as neat, one-to-one copies, but as familiar instincts. Who gets believed, who gets blamed, who gets help quickly, and who is asked to prove they deserve to exist. And that's why these facts were forbidden, not because they're hidden in a secret vault, but because they disrupt the comfortable story, the one where history is a noble staircase upward, rather than a maze with traps built into the floor. So let the story settle, let it drift like a low voice in a dark room, and if you want more quiet documentaries, more slow histories, more uncomfortable truths told gently, stay with this channel. Like, subscribe, and come back again. For now, breathe slowly. The corridor of the past can close behind you, and you can rest.